Welcome to Let's Talk Value Chain, a podcast where we explore the different activities, trends, topics, and components within value chains from manufacturing to impacts on supply chains to AI to blockchains.
I'm Nishant Raj, and welcome to Let's Talk Value Chain, or as we are calling it today's special episode, Let's Talk Podcasting. In honor of International Podcast Day, we decided to shake things up a bit. Last week, we asked you to send in all your burning questions about podcasting and everything from how to get started, tips and tricks on growing your own show. And wow, the response was incredible. Not only did the comment sections light up, but our DMs were buzzing with fantastic questions. Today, I'm excited to dive into these questions and share everything I've learned along my short podcasting journey. Join me and Anny Thakkar, our marketing and communication lead at Value Chain, who has carefully curated your questions from all our platforms. Today on International Podcasters Day, we are flipping the table, and instead of me asking the questions, I'll be on the other side answering the questions. And Annie, who's marketing communication lead at Value Chain, has kindly agreed to host this session for us. So Annie, over to you.
We received a lot of questions on our Instagram and LinkedIn. So I've tried to club some questions and remove the repeats so you can answer as many as possible. So let's jump into it. What inspired you to start Let's Talk Value Chain?
I think the key for me has been the method of communication and media is changing massively. And just because we are a business doesn't necessarily mean that we have to always go through the traditional routes of spreading awareness and communication. And podcast has become one of the such mediums now. Supply chain, what is close to us at Value Chain and what we do is a niche space, but there's a lot of knowledge that exists in that space. And for me, the key idea was taking the opportunity of this podcast to discuss and understand what value chain means for different businesses, for different sectors, in different roles, to increase the understanding for me personally, but also to anybody who would find that relevant.
So this is in reference to Let's Talk Value Chain as well as your previous podcast. So what were some of the biggest challenges that you faced when you were starting out on your own?
Before Let's Talk Value Chain, I've also had a personal podcast called How Did They Get There? Interviewing different leaders in industry, understanding what their career journey has been like. Getting started, I would say, is the hardest part. There's no one path to do this. If you want to do this, you just need to get started. You have to stop being a perfectionist because you will not be getting the top audio quality or the top video quality, but it's the context of what you're discussing, what you're sharing is more important to most people. It comes with trying to do as much as you can with this, and that's the only way you learn. Because before I actually got started with even the single podcast, I had tried approaches of doing podcasts, and this is pre-pandemic, by visiting guests in person and then doing that in-person podcast. The problem is that is not very efficient, neither for the host nor for the guest. It just becomes sort of a bottleneck when you're starting out. I also tried to address the same topic through a blog method and tried to do a lot of reach outs to different industry leaders and stuff. And the response rates were relatively low. So when the pandemic came along, what it did was everybody was suddenly comfortable doing these interviews virtually, and that helped massively because you can interview lots of guests within a period of a week without actually having to step out of your location. And that's the same thing for the guests as well, because it only takes a limited amount of their time. And I think it's a growth journey for everybody because there are so many great podcasts out there. And if you find this type of content interesting, then it's absolutely something that it's worth trying getting yourself into it to do it if you have a topic that you want to discuss or something that you're just inquisitive about.
What advice would you give to someone who's thinking of starting a podcast today? Like pandemic was that phase when probably most of the people got into podcasting because of, like you said, things
Yeah.
going virtual. But now that there's already so much in the market, what would you recommend?
I think it's Firstly, narrowing on what is that niche topic that you want to explore and you feel that at least one other person out there is going to find interesting, right? Because the goal of the podcast is not necessarily that it needs to be everything for everyone, but even if you are creating content which is useful for a handful of people, it's worth doing because it gets your message out there, it gets your thinking out there, and sometimes refines your thinking as well. My key advice is just get started. There's enough tools out there. You can start a podcast using just your phone. The tools like Riverside that you can utilize, but the only thing is just start, and then everything else will get figured out once you start.
So the next question, actually, you've already answered half of it, but what equipment and tools do you use to record your podcast?
To start off, I'd say you don't need any fancy equipment to get started. So it's not a case that you have to invest a lot in equipment to get started on a podcast. If you have a laptop, if you have a phone, you can get started. And in most cases, a lot of people do have that. So that's all you really need. But if you were trying to get, as you learn the process, it's good to get either a set of decent headphones or microphones, and camera quality. If you can, again, just improve this better. I use a Mac and it's not necessarily the best camera, especially if the lighting is not great. These are all nice to haves and not necessarily something the key, because if you're only listening to an audio version of the podcast, your camera quality doesn't matter. When people are listening to it, they're only listening to the conversation, the content. So you can get started with literally just the gadgets that you might already have today.
So how do you decide on topics and guests for each episode?
It's reaching out within my own network. Firstly, if the core topic that we're talking about, which is value chain, right? Like if that's
Yeah.
something that they will be interested to talk about. And the other thing that I look for is, is it something that I would be excited to explore further on or understand better to know? So when I meet new people and I meet people who are in different industries or, in different phases of life, and I can pick up on, there might be something that they are doing that could link in quite well. So that's where I go with that. Apart from the general theme, a very set outline that these are the exact guests and exact episodes that we're going to do, just because we don't want to restrict ourselves in that manner, and make sure that each piece of content that we record, that's more appropriate rather than being very rigid on the schedule.
So how important is it to niche down when starting a podcast? And how can someone find their niche?
So I think the key thing is you have to find your own interest, your hobbies, or things that you're passionate about, or things that you would want to understand better. So you want to be inquisitive about a topic. And to give you a reference, when I started my first podcast, how did they get there? One of the key topics for me to understand was you look at people's job descriptions and titles on LinkedIn and you think, oh, this guy is a director, this guy is a founder, this guy is a VP. And you think, oh, they would have already known exactly how to get to that position. That's
Yeah.
never the case. Everybody has a very different journey. And I was quite interested to understand what that journey is. And for different sectors, because manufacturing is something that I've been in for long, and it's not again, something that I've come across a lot of different podcasts on. So I wanted to talk to not people who are famous, but people that you can relate. It's something more understandable for most of us. The niche aspect is important because you can't be talking about everything for everyone. You need to narrow in on a broader area or broader question that you are trying to get answered. And then, the individual topics within the podcast itself could vary depending on, how you link that in. But it is definitely important to find your own niche, but you only do that, get to that by starting out. The other thing in terms of how they find the niche is look inward, look at what you like, what you would want to know, who you find interesting. And in reality, you know if nobody else even listens to your podcast, but you've actually managed to speak to a few people on this topic, got insight, that's still a win. It doesn't have to be 100 million revenue generating podcast.
Yeah, that's true. So coming to the 100 million revenue generating podcast, How do you promote your podcast and grow your audience?
So I think podcast growth, especially if you are small, right, and you don't have budgets, and this is something that we, as a team are all learning as well, is use a podcast as your pillar content and try to extract small sections of the podcast that you can snippets that you can share on social media, and apart from LinkedIn, which most professionals utilize, other social media platforms, definitely something that you should have a presence on. But the one that I've found most interesting and what I would recommend is start to put shots of your podcast on YouTube and on TikTok. And that's specifically because the algorithms in both these places is not reliant on the number of followers you have today, but on the piece of content and how it connects with the audience. And that is what's going to make a difference, because that's going to create an awareness for you without having to spend a lot of money. And then it's about also, sharing with people who are in your network, your friends, families, people you work with. Just share with them that, this is what you've done. And that's about it. And, let that effectively flow through. But also don't put too much pressure on the fact that, yeah, it needs to be generated 100
Yeah.
million views and stuff, because what is more important is a process and the fact that you can keep doing it. So
Yeah.
if you can keep talking to different people, gathering more content for your podcast, creating more understanding of the topic itself, all of that is a key learning.
So, what is the best way to engage with your podcast audience?
I think both direct and indirect. So we do the direct engagements in terms of, on LinkedIn, for example, when we're sharing stuff, we are asking for polls, we're asking for questions that want to be created. The other is, you can obviously, with feedback and comment that come on different podcast websites as well, for your podcast, you can actually interact through that. I would say it's depending on your style of it. And I think, again, you just be genuine about it and take it from there, rather than trying to create too much of a robotic process, because people are listening to a podcast for the human, connection, not because, it's a sales campaign or it's somebody who's very well refined trying to, pitch you these things.
Yeah, that's true. So, next question is a question that was asked by a lot of people across platforms. So, how do you stay consistent in releasing episodes while managing a busy schedule?
The first thing to say on that is I'm thankful for having a team, which includes Annie and the rest of the team in the background from us as well. Because when I was doing the first podcast on my own, it was trying to batch things up. So batch doing all the interviews and then batch trying to release it. It's sometimes, get difficult because you're trying to prioritize different things. I would say this phase of it is a bit more easy for me because I can actually focus on interviewing and speaking and getting the content generated, and then the team takes over. But what's also happened over last year or so that's massively different from versus when I was starting in the pandemic with this is there are a lot of AI tools out there now. And
Yeah.
Riverside, for example, it costs you about at least $20 a month, but that $20 a month will save you hours in terms of recording, editing, publishing. And especially when when you're starting out, in reality there's not a lot of editing and customizations that you have to do. If you have a little bit of pauses, stoppages and stuff like that, it's fine. But what the software also does, it actually takes a lot of cleans that audio out for you. So there are a lot of assistive tools, and as AI technology is expanding, that's going to become the key. The other thing which I didn't mention earlier was in the tools aspect is publishing of the podcast itself, right? So the tool that I started to use a couple of years ago was Anchor.fm, which is a free tool. You can set up your podcast and then it would deploy your podcast across multiple channels. So Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and a few others. And that's now been bought by Spotify. And it's again still free, same platform. And that's definitely something that I would recommend people that, and Riverside is actually linked into that. So you can actually record everything in Riverside, do the podcast, let it do the initial cleanup, and just publish it through that. So the workflows are becoming simpler, which means you don't necessarily need to spend loads of time. on this. Obviously, I'm lucky to have a team around me who can support me on this. So, we try to utilize as much of that as possible.
What is the most important factor, according to you, in keeping your listeners engaged throughout an episode?
I think the main thing that I've seen is not trying to go after a lot in terms of a very long podcast, at least when we are starting out. I do like that form of content with some like Tim Ferriss's podcast, but trying to keep things a bit more crisp with our guests, honoring their time as well. So ask questions that are relevant, and it's something that will be useful insight for our listeners. So I think that's really the key, is keeping that flow going, and do a preparation. There is value in having a free flowing conversation, absolutely. I think that's how we do most podcasts, but do prepare the outline of questions and guidances, and that flows through. And we use ChatGPT, for example, to help us actually curate that as well. So again, there are a lot of assistive tools out there that can help you guide that, and then just go for it. And look at the feedback. When people who have listened to it, they will give you feedback and tell you, if it was good or if it wasn't. But I think the key of that is just keeping it consistent. And again, your role as a podcast host is be inquisitive, and also not have basically an opinion in that aspect, because it is a conversation at the end of the day, right? It's not an interview that
Yeah.
that you would do. And I think that's a good learning aspect for me as well, but also a good chance where I can actually not talk a lot and actually listen in.
Okay. So I already know the answer to the next question, but a lot of people had asked this on YouTube. Do you script your episodes, or do you prefer more of like a free-flowing conversation?
So free flowing conversations are always good, but to get your guests in the right mindset and give them a bit of guardrails, and give a bit of guardrails for you as well, because you're trying to record, especially in our case, we're trying to record an episode which is less than 30 minutes, and time flows very quickly when you're having conversations, right? So what you do want is, you do want to capture the high level topics and try to make sure that at least you can get to those really. But if you do come across some a very good insight or nugget that you want to deeper dive in, that's absolutely fine as well. There's no specific rules in podcasting right now. And I think that's the beauty of it, but that's what also creates, challenges for a lot of people,
Okay.
because it depends on what are you measuring your success with. And you can see different forms of podcasts doing very different approaches and achieving success, either listeners, subscribe users, monetary increase, and different things. And I think for us, it's just trying to you know keep that consistent.
What are the top three mistakes that new podcasters often make when starting out?
I can only talk about myself in this. Trying to treat it like an interview, I'd say, is the first thing, because podcast is about a conversation, not just interviewing the other person out there. So I think that's something that I've learned and try to work on when we are having conversations. The other thing is, you have to plan it, and you have to get out of your comfort zone to do this. You might not even want to listen to your own voice after you've recorded it, but it's definitely valuable to spend a little bit of time on doing prep for these interviews, that you would do prep for understanding in terms of what's that question that you're trying to ask. And again, I think the biggest one for, let's say, people starting out, is actually getting themselves in the mindset that you need to start. And I think that's the main thing, is people feel that they would like to do something, but obviously day to day comes in the way. Once you get started and dedicate some time towards it, it starts rolling. And ask for help where required as well. So these are things that I've seen from my own personal experience, where you can actually improve upon. And for this specific, because I'd already done a bit of journey with my previous podcast, getting Let's Stock Value Chain off the ground was actually much quicker, because I didn't have to procrastinate thinking, oh, how do we do this? How do we do that? And we have come across new things and new tools which didn't
Yeah.
exist at the time. But that's the thing, if you get started on it, it's always going to help you.
Everyone gets stuck in the perfectionism loop. I thought it was just me.
No, it's a very common theme and with everybody, because creating a piece of content that you're going to put out on the web for everybody to see, I think that creates a bit of holding back if you're not a person who's, regularly
Yeah.
creating content. But if you don't, then it will never happen. And even if that topic has been talked about by different people, your own perspective might be slightly different. Your approach might be slightly different, and that's still unique. As I said, if nothing else, if you can, have even one person find value in that, including yourself, it's worth doing it.
So, how do you handle moments when you might lose momentum or struggle with ideas?
I think you just have to, you don't have to be too hard on yourself. And if you do lose momentum, or if something comes in the way, you have to accept that and continue, get to this when you have the chance, because there are certain things that might come up that just stop you, or you're not in the mental health space to be able to actually go and do these things. And that absolutely happens. And there could be other things happening in life or the world. The thing is that there are no rules. You can record and push a podcast episode every day, which is just you talking about something and pushing it out. You could do once a month, you could do 1 6 months. Think of a pace, try to get started with that. Don't overwhelm yourself thinking that you have to put out 100 episodes. In my first podcast, what I did try to do was try to have a clear end date in mind, which was at least having a batch of 8 to 10 interviews that I would do. And that for me then gave a clear line in the sand. Was okay, if I get these done, and then the version 2 of that still hasn't happened, and it's something that's on my list. But for the outside world and listeners, when you do that, you can put it out there. So there is no expectations. And also, when you're starting out, the best thing is there is no expectations, not for anybody
Yeah.
else, not from yourself. So your bar is very low. So anything that you're going to do is only going to take you up. So even if you only ever did one season of that podcast, that's enough. You at least did that and put it out there, which is, more than what you would, see a lot of people do. So that's, I think, the critical aspect is don't be hard on yourself. If you are passionate about it, if you want to do it, figure a way out, plan it in, and plan small aspects, do it in a concise aspect. Do like how Netflix does series, right? Do a binge of the first half of the season, and then nothing for the next couple of months, and then another binge of that. So I think, and these all methods are working for Netflix. So
Yeah.
we can always try these approaches.
Yeah. It's a great perspective. So, what future trends do you see in podcasting, particularly in the business and supply chain industry space?
Podcast is becoming more mainstream as long form content for people to consume. What I've personally seen as well is, and the pandemic was a bit weird, due to this, is I was listening to a lot more podcasts personally pre-pandemic when I was traveling for work versus when I was at home. I was listening to relatively less podcasts because depending on what you're doing, now, things are back to normal a bit more. So there's a lot more people again, that would be traveling, and during those, downtimes, it's always great to have something to listen to. So we have definitely seen the podcast media, pick up, and that's across different industries and sectors. And the trend also is towards just individual conversations happening. So not every podcast is requiring or having where they need to have a guest come in on every episode. It could be just them discussing a topic, talking about a topic, and different genres of those that's happening as well. I think that's those things we're starting to see. And as I said, the other trend is just the toolkits that are being made available to help individuals build this type of content. And Spotify has invested huge amounts in the
Yeah.
podcasting space as well. So I think it's those things are absolutely happening. From a business perspective and supply chain, again, I think the key thing is that content of those domains are now coming to this media platform, which
Yeah.
is new because it's, traditionally, if you were a business, you would not be, doing things like that. You would be doing more hardcore sales, and you would be doing all the general media and advertisement things that you do. But the perception is changing. And the other thing is people find it more relatable if they understand that you understand the domain. You know enough to know what you don't know as well. And just creating the awareness for me is the big thing, because the domains are very niche. And if somebody can learn from this domain, from our knowledge, from the discussions that we are doing, that's huge. And to give you the example, in our current season, we have interviewed people who've talked about generative AI and supply chain, which is an upcoming topic. And a lot of people have heard about it, but not know the details.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have found that interesting. We have talked about different digitization systems as well. And so there are different aspects that come into play with this. And I think what we are seeing is, doesn't matter the domain that you are in, what business you're running, there's always content that you can create for creating awareness and knowledge. And you should be giving that knowledge away for free in podcasts like this, because that's how it grows. And the more awareness you can create, the more questions you can ask and the more questions you can answer. And for any businesses, I would say, again, the podcasts and any kind of content that founders or leadership teams can create become a key source of pillar content that the marketing teams can utilize to keep a more personalized campaign shared as well, rather than, again, trying to do a hard sell approach that normally happens. And that's definitely something that, we believe in and what we are trying to do as a team. And that, I think, we like that approach and we're still working on that. But it's definitely something that's changed the industry, that you have to be now a content creator. Doesn't matter what your role in a business is and what business you are
Yeah,
in.
that's true. How can podcasts be used to foster community and drive social change?
So the community aspect is, I think, relatively the key aspect when it comes to podcasts. When you're talking in podcasts, you're talking about specific topic or domain. So, the people who are your listeners generally, and people who continue to be your listeners, already start to form this virtual community together, where you can actually have these discussions, opportunities, talking topics, or just viewpoints being shared. And it's, I think, leveraging that as an advantage, because if we talk about things like supply chain, scope 3, understanding of scope 3 emissions within supply chain, how that impacts businesses, what should small medium businesses do to be able to tackle that, to be able to actually already have a strategy in place or implementation in place. These are kind of things that, when we talk about our podcast, we talk about, we share. And you know it's those types of things that you start to drive more in detail. I think, again, in terms of how much social value you can directly impact, it's going to depend on the community that's created. But it's definitely a platform to enable you to create a community where people of similar mindset, similar interests can flock together. And when you have a community, then you can actually start to create more impact as well.
That's true. Last question. Any last words of advice for our budding podcasters?
I think the main and the single line I would say is, just get started. That's the only thing. International Podcasters Day, like if you asked me a couple of years ago what that was, would it be something that I would relate to? I would have said no. But now, having done a few of these, it's definitely something, a space that I enjoy, and it gives me an opportunity to speak to people and ask them questions which I could not in a social setting. And that creates for me a lot of good personal connections with those individuals, because now I know a bit more about who they are, where they started, what their understanding space is, and that's really helpful.
That's all from my end. Thank you so much, Nishant, for giving us the answers and being so patient throughout the interview.
No, I think and you did great, and it's interesting to be on the other side answering here.
Hope you enjoyed this episode and found our discussion intriguing and exciting. If you want to connect with me or any of our guests, you can see our content and connect details in the summary of this episode. This podcast is sponsored by Value Chain. Value Chain is a leading B2B SaaS platform for intelligent collaboration, performance management, net zero supply chain identification, risk and resilience building, and a platform to help you manage your local and global supply chains.